Welcome to today's Global Connections program. I'm Bill Miller. How has the United Nations changed since it was formed in 1945? What are some of the major issues it's dealing with today that were not even on the radar screen at that period? My guest today is an expert on the United Nations. My guest today is Ms. Linda Fasulo. Ms. Linda Fasulo is a veteran independent reporter who covers the UN for National Public Radio. Before, Ms. Fasulo also worked for NBC News and MSNBC, and she is the author of a very interesting book, An Insider's Guide to the United Nations, third edition, by the way, not first or second, but third. Linda Fasulo, welcome to today's Global Connections program.
Thank you very much, Bill. Pleasure.
I appreciate you being with me. Linda, we're going to get into the UN, but let's talk, well, we can start with your book. That's a good place to start. A very interesting book, An Insider's Guide to the UN. What were you hoping to accomplish when you wrote the first edition on this particular book, about this institution in this book?
Well, first off, I'm a reporter, and I have been covering the UN for, 7, 8, 9 years, and I felt that there was not enough information for me personally to really understand what the UN is all about, and it's the whole system. And so while I was covering breaking news, usually Security Council events, I found it difficult to find a source or sources that appealed to me in terms of getting the inside picture from the players. And so suddenly it dawned on me one day, hey, I'm here at the UN. A benefit of being at the UN is that everyone, diplomats, officials, are all here in the same house. And I had good relations with quite a number of them. And I thought, these are the best people to try to draw in and understand firsthand how things work. And so that really was the genesis. And then I proceeded to pick their brains and really get them to share their experiences.
And you mentioned the entire system of the UN, which is so important. We think back to 1945. The UN came out of the ashes of World War II. 60 million people had been killed. When the UN was formed, they really were more concerned about war and peace. They had economic and social development issues, human rights issues, but still war and peace was the #1 issue. But today we look at the United Nations, and that agenda is far broader than the people of President Franklin Roosevelt, who was the brainchild, I guess, the architect of the United Nations. But it's far broader today and much more comprehensive, is it not?
Absolutely. I mean, clearly the 3 pillars of the UN are preventing and maintaining international peace and security, promoting justice, human rights, and also economic and social development. So obviously those are the 3 main focuses. But to implement all those, the UN system has, is gigantic, and there are so many independent programs and funds and agencies who are, trying to achieve these goals. And of course, we're talking about everything from UNICEF and the World Health Organization to UNFPA, Population Fund,
right,
and all these agencies who try to implement the goals of the UN. But it is, there are dozens and dozens of organizations, some of which you really don't know what they do, but once you do investigation, it's interesting how they fit into the larger picture.
That's right, and they're helping to create this better world. And we were talking about the Security Council, and we talked about peacekeeping. They get probably, in the General Assembly, probably 20% of the total budget of the United Nations. The other 80% are the agencies that you mentioned, the World Health Organization, the UN Children's Fund, but also those agencies that help move aircraft, ships, mail, and weather information around the world that are really doing a Herculean job every day, but they get no credit, and they certainly get no publicity. But it's the Security Council and peacekeeping, and maybe the General Assembly every now and then. It gets probably 95% of all the coverage, isn't it? Or
absolutely.
Close to it.
Absolutely. Those agencies you mentioned, the International Civil Aviation Agency and the International Postal Union, yes, they help make our lives work well internationally. But you're right, they don't get much publicity, and they're usually not in New York. I think part of that is also an issue, although, it has a small impact. But in general, I think that, you can't take it away, the fact that first and foremost, I think people turn to the UN in terms of its ability to help prevent and deal with world crises, whether it's conflicts and wars, and now today international terrorism, proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, ISIS, that kind of thing. Issues, challenges that are really feel threatening to everyone.
And climate change and Ebola certainly were not on the radar screen in 1945.
For sure.
Now you have somewhat of a CEO. It's kind of a loose definition of a chief executive officer, the Secretary General of the United Nations, and there now are 9. Antonio Guterres, who's the incoming Secretary General. The 8th is Ban Ki-moon, who just retired not long ago. What is the role of the Secretary General? And maybe we could look at these two gentlemen and kind of talk just briefly about the skills that they brought to the job or will bring to the job.
Well, as you know, in the UN Charter, the role of Secretary General is really just described as Chief Administrative Officer. And so based on that, individual Secretaries General have basically forged their own way through in terms of establishing how they function and what they do, and how they're received. I shouldn't say always well received by member states. And so I think it's very individualistic. You know, of course, Kofi Annan was, I guess, the 7th Secretary General. He left at the end of 2006. And Ban Ki-moon came in January 2007. At that juncture, I think there was a agreement, or there was a real sense among many of the big powers particularly, that they did not want a rock star, a diplomatic rock star, which of course Kofi Annan had been alluded to be, because it was very popular. He provided good sound bites. Editors loved him. You figured him in terms of dealing with crisis. You wanted to know, what does Kofi Annan think? So fast forward, when the 8th Secretary General was being selected, there was much pressure among the big 5, including the United States, not to have such a big personality, such a public personality. And I think that's the decision was to hone in on Ban Ki-moon, who is a much more low-key person, low profile. He had been the foreign minister of South Korea. But aside from that, was really not a known entity in the larger world, particularly in the West.
Now you mentioned the big 5. We're talking about the permanent members, 5 permanent members of the UN Security Council, a 15-member body, but the 5 permanent members are on there forever, and they have a veto, and that's the United States, Russia, China, United Kingdom, and France. So those 5 have to agree on a Secretary General, then the Security Council has to agree, then it goes to the General Assembly, the 193-member body, for approval. And if we could, let's talk about Ban Ki-moon. He received some people expressed concern over the years that he was a little too low-key, low profile, too much behind the scenes, maybe not as much in front of the camera as some people would have liked. But there were certain areas that, 2 or 3, that he really excelled, did he not? Like in climate change, or with women's rights, UN Women, LGBT activities at the UN, things like that.
Yeah, I think those are the 3 issues, actually, or among the major issues, that there is largely agreement that he has made an impact. I know that when he first assumed office, he clearly said that climate change was on his agenda and he wanted to advance it. And 10 years ago, there really was not that much focus internationally on climate change, and he really played a major role rallying support, getting various countries to think about it and get involved. And of course, we know the Paris Agreement was reached last year. And so I think the assumption is that probably will go down as his biggest legacy.
It certainly will, no doubt about it. Well, Trygve Lie, the first Secretary General, told Dag Hammarskjöld, the second Secretary General, that being Secretary General is the, quote, most difficult job in the world. Is it the most difficult job?
Well, I don't know if it's the most difficult, but I would think it's certainly among the top.
It's right up there.
I don't know if a U.S. president would say they don't have the most difficult job. But anyway, that being said, yeah, there's little doubt that the Secretary General has a balancing act to deal with. I mean, as everyone has said, it's the UN as a club consisting of 193 countries, very diverse, coming from backgrounds rich, poor, and in the middle. Some good countries, some not so good countries. The rogue states are here within the institution, and so it's very difficult for a Secretary General who very often says that they have 193 board members. who think they're, I think one of them has said, who think they're the
What a
chairperson.
nightmare. What a nightmare.
Can you imagine? And so, I mean, clearly there's greater attention given to the interests of the 5 Permanent Security Council members, who, as we know, provide a lot of the financial input, as well as, are there if military action has to be taken. And so, yeah, I mean, I think it is very, very, very difficult. And also because he has to deal with not just the big powers and moderate powers, but again, with those countries who are the objects, for example, of the peacekeeping operations. Countries that are at war, in civil war, or aggressors are also part of the mix. And so I think it's pretty complicated to deal with the countries the Security Council, the UN's trying to, resolve a crisis in. So it's complicated.
Well, you're watching Global Connections Television, which is a privately funded, independently produced program. The opinions expressed on Global Connections are solely those of the moderator and his guest. We would encourage our viewers to go to our website at www.globalconnectionstelevision to view previous programs. Also, if you are involved with a PBS or community access television station, or perhaps an educational institution that has an intra-campus television hookup, or you just have a website and you have an interest in our programs, please feel free to download them and to share them with anyone. Global Connections Television is provided free of charge at no cost as an international public service. Today we're taking a look at the United Nations and how it has developed, well, from 1945 until today, and how it will probably develop even more diversely in the future. My guest today is an expert on the United Nations, and my guest today is Linda Fasulo, who is an independent veteran journalist who covers the United Nations for National Public Radio. Linda, we're talking about the CEOs. Now let's talk about some of the issues. What do you perceive as 2 or 3 of the major issues that we're going to confront as we move well into the 21st century now?
Well, I think, obviously I would be remiss not to talk about Syria and the impact that Syria has been having on the world, really, in terms of producing lots of refugees, of the major problems resulting from Syria. I mean, it's the 6th year now, but I think that there's the first glimmer of hope that perhaps, there could be, or there's movement towards discussions about a possible resolution of the crisis. And that's a real breakthrough, I think. And we'll have to see what happens. The proof is in the pudding. But there does at least seem like there's some movement. When you look at even late last year, it was really, really grim. And it still is grim. I'm not saying it's not. But with a peace conference, planned, and opposition as well as government planning to participate, that's a big change. The other issue, of course, is international terrorism. And that, of course, as we know, is probably an issue that's been in the forefront since 9/11. But what we have today seems to many people to be even worse, and that is the formation of ISIS. And ISIS is just, I think people thought Al-Qaeda was a major threat to international peace and security, but I guess now ISIS, which operates as a quasi-state, has its own sources of revenue, has been selling oil, et cetera, is remarkably brutal, I think, in terms of even terrorists. There's agreement that its means of getting its way, has been just atrocious. And so, there's still a fight to defeat them. I mean, they still occupy parts of Syria and Iraq, and I think some of the latest thinking is that it could take 10, 20 years to achieve this. And so we're going to have that to deal with in the foreseeable horizon. The other issue, of course, is proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, North Korea, and the fear that they're getting much more closer to creating intercontinental ballistic missile. We know they have medium range. And so the UN really has its work cut out. And while there are extensive sanctions against North Korea, probably the most stringent since the sanctions were imposed on Saddam Hussein's Iraq. But nonetheless, it's far from clear if we're going to be successful, if the world will be successful in preventing it from becoming a nuclear weapon state.
And you mentioned ISIS, and of course right now ISIS is being rolled back in Iraq. they still have strong footholds in Syria and other places. But the thing too with terrorists is that all you need is one person to have or a small group of terrorists, and they can wreak havoc. All you need, and I don't want to give people ideas, is a car and a 30-06 rifle, and you can shut down a town. And that's one of the challenges we're going to be confronting. But the UN has been one of the stalwarts of the UN agencies, not just the United Nations in New York, but the agencies have been very much on board in combating Al-Qaeda, combating terrorism over the years. And we think back to the airline hijackings back in the 60s, 50s, 60s, and 70s. And today, that's the same type of thing. They're dealing with the International Civil Aviation Organization, bringing the airlines together to develop rules and regulations to make sure that you don't have terrorists getting on planes or blowing them up in midair. So the UN system has been very involved in dealing with all these problems we're talking about, as far as helping to mobilize the world.
Right, exactly. I mean, I think there's been an active role on the UN is playing, although of course, it's not the central role. It's really up to
exactly.
Individual countries to really defeat it.
Another thing that people are concerned about too is the fact that maybe some of these terrorists might get nuclear materials, which would be an absolute disaster. You hear about the suitcase bombs being floated up the East River or something like that in New York City. And that, again, is something that we really have to be worried about. And, of course, it will take the nations of the world to come together through an international institution to combat these problems, will it not?
Absolutely. I mean, it'll take solidarity. I mean, unanimity. I mean, countries. I think that's part of the problem of the world, of course, is that you have such diverse countries and you have those who are supporting terrorism and the majority who aren't. So it'll take good cooperation and focus.
It certainly will take a lot of focus, to put it mildly, yes. Well, you and I have studied the UN for years and years, and you've written a book on the UN. I teach a course on the UN. But how do you feel that the journalists, I don't want to paint them with a broad brush, cover the United Nations as far as getting information about the UN out? Do we focus more so on the Security Council and peacekeeping, and as opposed to maybe covering some of the other UN agencies like the UN Children's Fund or the High Commission for Refugees or somebody like that, or some group like that, to help the general public better understand the UN and how it impacts their lives? The UN touches our lives every day.
Well, I do think that first and foremost, the greatest interest is in the work of the Security Council and, attaining peace and security, so to speak. But I do think that, for example, the refugee crisis and, the whole humanitarian efforts of the UN, which have skyrocketed, I think those issues are gaining more attention among media organizations, which really haven't in the past. Because I know that, and also UN studies about humanitarian crises, human rights. I think human rights abuses are moving up there in terms of growing interest on the part of the media. But then again, the reality is, these things, the UN coverage rises and falls with the leadership role of the UN in dealing with any of these crises.
Exactly, it certainly does, yes, there's no doubt about it. Well, you've written about the United Nations. What do you have one or two recommendations to proffer that would help make the UN a more efficient and a more effective organization, and really to be more relevant in the future? But as we mentioned earlier, that it does touch our lives, but so often we don't know about that. But are there any suggestions you could make to the incoming Secretary General or to anybody who has an interest in this?
Well, I think what's interesting is the new Secretary General, first and foremost, said, of course, that he's promoting peace is the key priority. But to do so, he feels that the UN has to be reformed in the sense to make it more nimble and agile, less bureaucratic, better able to resolve crises. And, perhaps someone who comes in with that goal, and knows how to manage, because a lot of it is managerial, getting good staff, moving them to the right places. I think there's been criticism that it could take, 100 days, maybe 200 days to actually hire a staff member. Getting better quality peacekeepers, I know that's a big issue, and because let's face it, these peacekeeping operations today are really, robust organization. They have robust goals. They're there to protect civilians, which previous peacekeeping operations really weren't. They were there to serve as a buffer. And so there's a lot of change. I mean, even in peacekeeping operations, they're getting much more dangerous. And I think managing those for the UN to play a more direct role in terms of organizing that could be very important to resolving crises.
Internal management is extremely important.
Exactly.
It is very important.
Exactly.
Yes, it certainly is. And of course, public relations, telling people what you're doing is extremely important too, and to get that out. And I know they do, the UN does, with the Department of Public Information and through the noon briefings, the press briefings, and that type of thing. Well, the last couple of minutes we have, you've met probably every high-level person from most countries around the world here at the United Nations, the high-level diplomats. You've interviewed a large number of them, spoken with them. Are there a couple of you have many memorable experiences, a lot of which are contained in an insider's guide to the UN, but are there one or two that come to the surface just automatically when you think of the UN, you think, aha, I remember meeting this person or this event that happened?
Well, I think what's interesting about the UN is that because it's a multilateral organization, as you say, you get to meet, diplomats and officials from all over the world. And like anything, you can establish a rapport. Either you have chemistry with people, or you don't. And if you happen to have that good chemistry and relationship with key players, it makes your life much easier in terms of being a journalist. And, there have been real characters. There have been people that, after Security Council meetings, it used to be, now it's much more restrictive with physical barriers that have been put up for security reasons. But previously, you pretty much as a journalist had free reign. After Security Council stakeout, diplomats would walk down the corridor to make a left to leave or go to the diplomatic lounge. Now, a number of them went to the diplomatic lounge, and not just for coffee. So I can recall, like moseying in, and most of the times the diplomats who went to the lounge were not reticent, or they weren't there to have some private meeting, because you really can't have a private meeting. They were there to talk to whomever came. And I remember being offered, a glass of scotch, it's like 10:30 in the morning. And, so you had to be a little bit of an actor. Oh yeah, I'll have it, and, pretend a little that you're drinking it. So I think that those are kind of memorable moments, but also importantly, there were moments where you could establish trust with people and you could get good information. And it's a little harder, I think, now to get that sort of one-on-one closeness and, with diplomats.
As Madeleine Albright once said, the UN is not perfect, but it is, quote, indispensable, unquote, and it certainly is, even with all of its warts and imperfections. And all we have to do is think about how difficult it is to bring really a myriad of players together. But when you bring 193 countries together that represent every economic system, every religious value, cultural value in the world under one roof, and to try to get them to agree on some really tough issues, it's amazing the UN accomplishes as much as it does. But Linda, you've done a great job on this book that you have written, and I'm sure that many of our viewers will want to buy it. But I want to thank you so very much for a very interesting and a very informative program.
Thank you. My pleasure.
Thank you. I'm Bill Miller. Thank you for joining us today on Global Connections Television.